speaker today is Liz Fuller.
Yay!
No pressure. And you don't know me, but you know Liz Fuller. All around. Yeah. But I did that a couple weeks ago with Yusette, and she took right over. Told me to sit down. Okay. Miss Liz is in her 4th year as president of the Southport Historical Society, and I'm so glad that she was there to take over when I backed out. The things I know about Liz, and I'm sure you guys have done that too, because you observed them, you've been to these programs, but she does everything well.
Oh, now there's pressure.
Everything that she works on. And she's also, within that, a pleasure to work with. Little story that she was in corporate America, and when she left the corporate scene, she then went to earn a PhD. And she wanted that PhD so that she could work with nonprofit organizations. Right? I think that's pretty neat that someone would take that. I was president when she came on the board, and after a month or a couple months, I said, "You're definitely going to be the Rookie of the Year." It turned out that I gave her the MVP, the Most Valuable Player Award, by the end of the year. Pat, do you think I made a good choice there?
You did.
And I think you're going to have some fun with this presentation and the topic. So we'll see. I'd also like to introduce Kim Brown, and Kim's back there on the camera. Okay. And within a month or two, Kim will be on the camera. She'll be taking the reservations at the door, and she'll be introducing the speaker, as well as putting the chairs up and taking them away. Thank you, Kim. Ms. Liz?
Okay. Yes, I warmed it up for you. All right, well that was something. He's gonna get me crying before I start my program, but hopefully we'll have fun with this. I think you're gonna find it interesting. So, and I'm really happy to be doing this presentation. One of the things, I've mentioned this before, I'm always fascinated with Southport history because it's just this little town, and yet it seems to connect with so many different national and international events. And in the last few months, we've talked about the Revolutionary War and the Civil War and the Jim Crow era and civil rights and all of those things. But I actually never expected to find a connection to the Scopes monkey trial. And for those of you
Accidental touch.
not familiar with it, the Scopes monkey trial was the original trial of the century. That phrase gets bandied about, but it was first bandied about 100 years ago in 1925 for the Scopes monkey trial, when they said this is the trial of the century. It ignited a fierce national debate about science, religion, education that in many ways we're still having 100 years later. And the man who orchestrated this entire spectacle was a young, ambitious innovator who once lived right here in Southport, and his name was George Rappleyea. I assume I'm pronouncing that correctly. If anybody knows how to pronounce Rappleyea differently, let me know. Okay, so our story starts in the spring of 1915. A 21-year-old George Rappleyea and his 45-year-old recently widowed mother arrive in Southport. They purchase a home right here in town, and on the corner of Moore and Boundary Streets. Does anybody know, well, other than Pat, does anybody know what Boundary Street is called today?
Grove Street.
No, not quite. Boundary? Caswell, right. That used to be the boundary. Sorry, Pat, I knew you would know. So we know that is Caswell. But Rappleyea didn't come here to settle down quietly. He is a man of action. Despite his youth, he's already very accomplished. He has a degree in civil engineering. He graduated from college in Ohio at 18, and he's already worked for 3 years in Virginia as a hydroelectric engineer and the installation of a municipal light and power plant. He's ambitious, he's full of modern ideas, and he sees potential everywhere. So he and his mother purchased the Southport Light and Power Company at a public auction. They get it for $7,800, which calculates to $250,000 in today's money.
Wow.
The plant was located at Bonnet's Creek. Back then it was called Fiddler's Drain, and there was a pumping station situated near the hospital. At the time, only about 1 in 5 houses in Southport had electricity, and many people were still pretty wary of it. But George saw the future. So he and his mother invested another $10,000, or about $300,000 in today's money, improving the machinery, expanding the transmission lines and transformers, and completing an independent line between the power plant at Fiddler's Drain and the pumping station at the hospital. So the equivalent of about $500,000 they put into that. And then after George began rebuilding the power plant, and then he did something really clever. And it's something that shows you, not only was he an engineer, but he was a promoter. And he figured out it was going to be a hard sell to get the houses upgraded to electricity. But what he did was, instead of going to the owners of the houses, he went to the tenants. And he worked out easy terms that they could get electricity put into their houses. And the owners were happy about that because they were getting their homes upgraded at no cost. And of course the tenants were benefiting because they had electricity. It wasn't electricity the way that we think of it now, 24/7, flipping on the switch, running all sorts of appliances. It usually ran most evenings after dark. So in the evenings. And the first few years, that's how it ran. And then in the early 20s, they also added Friday afternoons so that people could do their ironing.
Oh, yeah.
So Rappley's work, however, was interrupted by the call of duty. When the United States entered World War I, he was drafted and served as a second lieutenant in the Army Corps of Engineers. Mostly he served at Caswell doing engineering, but he also did a little bit in Virginia. In a remarkable act of patriotism, while he was away serving his country, he leased the power plant back to the town of Southport for free. After the war, his engineering skills were in high demand, and they led him to a new opportunity, managing a series of struggling coal and iron mines just outside a small town in Tennessee. And this move was very important to Rappleyea because it's where he met the love of his life and married the love of his life, Ova Corvin, whom he called Precious. And the move was important to the nation, too, because it would place him and the values he represented at the very center of American history. And that little town was none other than Dayton, Tennessee, population 1,800. So to understand how this Southport innovator ended up at the center of this national firestorm, we have to understand the America he was living in 100 years ago. So it was the Roaring 20s, and we usually equate that with jazz and flappers, and it seems fun. But it was also a decade of deep, bitter conflict and a battle for the very soul of the nation. This battle was fueled by a powerful backlash from a segment of white Protestant America who felt that their country and their values and their way of life were under attack. And this fear was coming at them from all directions at once. First, there was a wave of anti-immigrant panic. Millions of Catholic and Jewish immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe were pouring into the cities. and to the established Protestant majority, they seemed foreign and threatening. This fear helped fuel the rise of a new, powerful Ku Klux Klan, 5 million strong, much larger than it had ever been in the 1800s. It was spread across the entire country with its headquarters in Indiana. It expanded its hateful message to target beyond Black Americans, to target Catholics, Jews, and immigrants. It was an anxiety so strong it led to the Restrictive Immigration Act of 1924, which slammed the door shut on many who wanted to come here. At the same time, the country was at one of its lowest levels of race relations. Black soldiers fought in World War I for democracy in Europe, and they came home expecting a greater share of it for themselves. And this was met with horrific violence. The Red Summer of 1919 saw massacres of over 1,000 Black citizens across the entire United States as white mobs used terror to enforce a brutal Jim Crow hierarchy. And then you had the two great constitutional changes that were going on at that time. The 18th Amendment for Prohibition was seen as a great moral victory for the traditional rural America. But in the cities, there was a lot more crime associated with it, and many people openly defied the law. So it only confirmed the belief of rural America that the cities were corrupt dens of foreign influence. And then there was the 19th Amendment for women's suffrage. It unleashed the new woman who was independent, politically active, and not happy to stay quietly at home, which is a terrifying disruption to the traditional family order. So all of these streams of anxiety, the increase of immigration, especially from Eastern and Southern Europe and Asia, and the rise of African Americans, the increase of crime in the cities brought about by Prohibition, and the increased rights of women, which brought them outside of the home, all of these converged into a powerful river of reactionary politics. And the movement that rose to counteract that this moment was called Christian fundamentalism. It grew explosively during this period because it offered an answer to all this free-floating anxiety and chaos. And the answer it offered was a return to pure, traditional Protestant America. And as the Christian fundamentalists saw the world changing so rapidly, their focus turned urgently to the next generation. They became consumed with a new concern, the influence over children's minds in public schools. The classroom became the ultimate battleground. If they couldn't stop the world from changing, then they had to protect their children from the changing world. And so this crusade to protect the hearts, minds, and souls of the children led directly to Tennessee passing the Butler Act. You see a part of it there. It's a law making it illegal for any public school teacher to teach any theory that denies the story of the divine creation of man as taught in the Bible. And so this is where George Rappleyea, our man from Southport, steps back onto the stage. By 1925, Dayton, Tennessee, like many small towns, was struggling economically. The leaders were desperate for investment. And so on May 4th, when George Rappleyea saw a small ad placed by the ACLU in the Chattanooga Times, Chattanooga paper, they were looking for someone to challenge the Butler Act. And when George saw this, he didn't just see a legal battle. The promoter in him saw a golden opportunity. So he walked over to Robinson's drugstore, which acted sort of as the unofficial city hall for the town. The superintendent of public schools owned Robinson's, and people tended to gravitate there. The town leaders tended to gravitate there. And he came in and he pitched an audacious idea to the town leaders. He said, let's host the trial here. His motive, he said, we'll put Dayton on the map, and that was his motive. A sensational trial, he thought, would bring in reporters and tourists and money. The town leaders were very enthusiastic. They all agreed. All they needed was a defendant. And so they summoned a young, well-liked teacher named John T. Scopes. Now Scopes was actually the football coach, and he taught some math, and sometimes he substituted as a biology teacher. So they called him over to the drugstore. They showed him the textbook, which had evolution in it. It was the state issued textbook that had it in there, and they said, "Did you teach this?" And he said, "Probably." It's in the book. If I was substituting that day, I would have. Yeah, sure. He wasn't really sure if he had taught it, but he was a firm believer in academic freedom. And after talking to his friends and his employers, and he understood that it would help the town, and he believed in academic freedom, so he agreed to be the man at the center of the storm. So George telegraphed the ACLU and said, "We've got a case, let us know you want to do it, and we'll arrange to arrest him." So they did. And then, just as he had brought electricity to Southport, George Rappleyea was about to bring the full, glaring spotlight of the world media to this small Tennessee town. And as always, he was the ultimate promoter. He realized that the defense team would need a place to stay. They were all coming in from other places, so he refurbished an abandoned 18-room house that was known as the mansion, the defense mansion, to serve as headquarters for the defense team. And then Dayton itself started to transform into a carnival. The town was overrun with over 200 reporters, not just from America, but from London, Toronto, and beyond. Every word spoken in that courthouse was cabled across the oceans as the world watched to see what this spectacle said about the soul of America. There were tourists, there were gawkers, there were vendors selling toy monkeys. There were even 2 chimpanzees that were brought to town for publicity. They were offered, one was offered to the prosecution, one was offered to the defense as exhibits in the trial if they wanted to use them. I think they felt this one proved the point. It's likely that all of this hullabaloo, or maybe not, had even exceeded Rappleyaa's initial vision. He had successfully manufactured an international media event. And what he had first set in motion around that little drugstore table would become known as the first great trial of the century. And into this circus walked the giants of the age, and they turned a local court case for a misdemeanor crime into a national showdown. So the first one was for the prosecution. This is William Jennings Bryan. He was a 3-time presidential candidate. He was a political legend. He'd served as Secretary of State. He was the voice of the populist democracy and the revered champion of Christian fundamentalism. And to millions of Americans, he was defending not just a state law, but God, the Bible, and the will of the people themselves. And then for the defense, there was Clarence Darrow. He was the most famous and the most controversial lawyer in America. He was known to be a staunch agnostic, and he was known for defending unpopular causes. He saw the case as a battle for intellectual freedom against the forces of ignorance. And when he heard that William Jennings Bryan would be arguing for the prosecution, he had to be part of the case. So he called up, said, "I'm going to do it." He agreed to forego his fee and work for the defense for free. And then the third giant was, chronicling it, was the acerbic journalist H.L. Mencken. He wrote for the Baltimore Sun. He was witty, cynical, and often cruel in his dispatches. And he would shape how the nation viewed the trial. He rather famously derided the local culture of Dayton, calling the people yokels. And his reporting cemented the national image of the trial as a clash between urban enlightenment and rural ignorance. And he is credited with coining the enduring name, the Monkey Trial. So these 3 men, Clarence Darrow, William Jennings Bryan, and H.L. Mencken, represented the deep divisions that were in the country, and their clash would define that moment. So the trial began on July 10th, 1925, 100 years ago. So here you see John Scopes. This is one of his attorneys, and this is George Rappleyea. They're heading to court. So I did a close-up so you could see them better, but I also want to pull back and show you this full picture. They're actually walking under this banner, read your Bible. And there were banners and signs and booths, anti-evolutionary booths, all around town. I assume there were some the other way too, but it was very, people chose sides and very much got engaged in it. Okay, so day one of the trial, it was spent on jury selection, and even that was a spectacle. Reporters crammed the courthouse, townspeople packed the benches, and Darrow and Brian sparred back and forth trying to decide who was going to sit in judgment of this case. And so here you see the jury being sworn in.
There's no women.
No, women couldn't serve on juries back then, and it looks like they're all white men. Black men could serve, but didn't often. They might not have been selected. So, yes, it was all white men. Probably all farmers, I think. The next few days brought opening arguments. The prosecution's case was very simple, very straightforward. John Scopes had broken the law, and that was all the jury needed to decide. The defense tried to broaden the case into a question of science and liberty and academic freedom, because they were really trying to contest the law as being unconstitutional rather than arguing whether Scopes broke the law. But the judge kept pulling it back to the single point of law. Did Scopes break the law or not? That's all we want to focus on here. Then came the students. I don't have any pictures of the students, but one by one they testified that Scopes had taught them evolution straight out of their state-approved biology book, and Scopes never denied it. In fact, his lawyers insisted that he had, because the whole point was to challenge the law itself. I included this picture because it was labeled as the defense team strategizes. It doesn't look to me like there's a lot of strategizing going on. It looks to me kind of like a posed picture, like maybe they were working and somebody said, hey, I want to take your picture. But what I found amusing about it was in all of these people standing around, right in the center there's George Rappleyea. And he's got his arm around somebody on the defense team, but he's like right in the center of things. And I find it interesting how he ends up always in the center of things. And then the defense called experts. They brought them into town, paid for them to come, scientists, theologians, scholars. They were ready to defend evolution and even reconcile it with religion in some ways. And this is them sitting in front of that mansion that I said. They're all sitting there. Sorry it's so blurry, but I wanted to show you again right there. It's George Rappleyea. They did try to come, and they were called to give testimony. The judge heard their testimony, or some of the testimony, in chambers and said, yeah, the jury's not going to hear this. It doesn't have anything to do with whether or not John Scopes broke the law. But he did allow their written statements to be entered into the record for appeal, but the jurors never heard a word of it. And then, by then we were at the 10th day of the trial, and this is when this came down to the drama that made history. On this day, Clarence Darrow did something that everyone hoped for, but no one really expected. He called William Jennings Bryan himself to the witness stand. So think about that. This is on the prosecution side, one of the prosecuting attorneys, and he called him up as a witness to be cross-examined. And this may seem insane. Why would he do that? And why would Brian agree to that? But especially because not only was he taking the stand, but he was facing off against a lawyer with a reputation like Darrow. Darrow, ate people for lunch. But Brian was a fundamentalist preacher. He was an expert on the Bible. He was a well-known orator, and he was confident in his ability to stand up to Darrow. And he was just as interested in providing his beliefs, that his beliefs were right and that evolution was wrong, as much as Darrow was in arguing in the opposite way. So for William Jennings Bryan, the reason he was so involved in this trial was that he saw it as a battle for democratic control over education. He argued, this is a matter for the nation, the question of the right of the people who created and support the schools to control them. If not they, then who? And so he agreed to take the stand. And amazingly, the judge allowed it. I was also surprised by that he would allow that. But then when you think about it, the whole town was buzzing, not just the town, but all the people who had come in. There were reporters from every part of the nation with their little book tablets writing everything down. There were visitors from all over wanting a glimpse of history. I really think he couldn't have made another decision. I think he might have had a riot. Everyone was desperate for this clash between these two intellectual giants. That's what they wanted to see. So the heat inside the courtroom was really, really stifling that summer, and they were really having a hard time. Plus, not only was it hot in the courthouse, no air conditioning, probably not enough windows, but then you had all those people crammed in. It was really a nightmare. So the judge decided, and because so many people wanted to see this interaction between these two men, to move it outside. So this cross-examination actually took place outside. They had a wooden platform that they built, and then people could just all gather around. They were packed shoulder to shoulder, trying to get close enough that they could hear. So there, under the blazing Tennessee sun, hundreds, maybe thousands of people fanning themselves, jostling for space. They faced off, and it's the most famous cross-examination in American history. And so, with the whole nation listening on the radio, Darrow began his interrogation. Now again, Darrow was widely known as an agnostic. He wasn't interested in discussing the morality of Christian teachings, but in the science of the Bible. That's where he felt the conflict was. So he asked questions like, do you really believe that that whale swallowed Jonah? And Brian replied, I believe it, and I believe in a God who can make a whale and can make a man and make both do what he pleases. And the crowd loved that response. There was much applause. And Brian did a pretty good job of using humor to deflect the questioning. Darrow said, Mr. Brian, do you believe that the first woman was Eve? Yes, I do. Do you believe she was literally made from Adam's rib? I do, Mr. Darrow. And the local crowd just roared its approval. Then Darrow pressed on. Did you ever discover where Cain got his wife? And with a smirk, Brian replied, no, sir, I leave you agnostics to hunt for her. The crowd laughed uproariously at this joke. So as one historian noted, if you were sitting in that courtyard with the crowd in Dayton, Brian was the clear winner. He had the crowd eating out of the palm of his hands. The transcripts are filled with notations of applause and laughter that had taken place. But Darrow understood something crucial. He wasn't playing to the crowd in Dayton. He knew he wasn't going to win them over. He was playing to the millions of Americans listening at home and to the countless others reading the daily reports in newspapers from London to Berlin. And to that wider global audience, Darrow's relentless questioning made Brian's literal interpretations of the Bible seem simplistic. So for nearly 2 hours, Darrow and Brian sparred beneath that grueling sun. Each man was at the top of his game, matched against a worthy opponent. Their exchange, the intensity of their exchange shook the crowd, and reporters knew they were watching history unfold. But then the very next day, Judge Ralston declared the entire exchange irrelevant and threw it out. He said it had nothing to do with the question at hand, whether John Scopes had violated the Butler Act by teaching evolution to local school children. That's what we're here to decide. So he ordered the testimony expunged from the record, and he ordered the jury to disregard what they had heard. But although that fiery encounter was erased from the transcript, it was never erased from America's memory. So that day, the day that he threw out that testimony, was the 11th day of the trial, and closing arguments were planned. There was nothing else to say. But again, Darrow surprised everyone. He waived his own summation. The defense had never denied that John Scopes had taught evolution. In fact, they insisted on it. Because their case was never about Scopes' innocence, it was about the law itself, a law they believed was unjust, unconstitutional, and a danger to freedom of thought. So instead of spending time arguing that Scopes had not broken the law, Darrow said, we ask your verdict of guilty so that we can make our test case. So basically, find him guilty, we want to appeal it. And because, and this was the way Tennessee's law was then, I don't know if it's still this way now, but because the defense waived a summation, the prosecution wasn't able to give one either. So Brian had been prepared. He was going to give a long, fiery summation before this captivated national, international audience. He hoped it would be the climax of his career, but he was denied the opportunity. So the jury retired to deliberate. They had heard no testimony from the scientists. They could consider none from William Jennings Bryan, and not even from John Scopes himself, because his attorney had advised him to remain silent. The jury took only 9 minutes to reach a verdict, and what do you think it was?
Guilty.
Guilty. And that was the irony. The trial of the century, the trial that pitted science against religion, modern views against tradition, and drew the eyes of the world to Dayton, Tennessee, ended not with a bang, but a whimper. 11 days of passion, headlines, spectacle, distilled into a verdict that was delivered in less time than it takes to hard-boil an egg. Scopes was fined $100. His career as a teacher was over. He never taught again. Instead, he went back to school, he switched careers, and became a geologist for an oil company. Sadly, William Jennings Bryan paid an even heavier price, having poured his last ounce of energy into the fight. This old political lion died in his sleep in Dayton just 5 days after the trial concluded. Yeah. They're saying after trial ended, and it says this in the headline, he was talking constantly. He was giving presentations and speeches and things like that, and they felt like he just wore himself out. So while the trial itself fizzled, its legacy roared, for it was never really about John Scopes or even Dayton. It was about the broader struggle of a nation caught between two worldviews, one clinging to tradition and religious doctrine, and the other rushing toward the modern era. It was about the place of science in classrooms, the reach of religion in public life, and the meaning of freedom itself. And that's why the Scopes trial still echoes today, because it forced America to confront questions we're still wrestling with nearly a century later. 30 years after it ended, the trial was immortalized in a celebrated Broadway production, which ran from 1955 to 57. The play was a fictionalized retelling of the Scopes trial, and it was meant not only to reflect the 1925 clash over evolution, but also as a commentary on the McCarthy era of the 1950s, when freedom of thought was again under attack. And it looks like Tony Randall played in it.
Yes.
Then in 1960, it was turned into the classic film Inherit the Wind, starring Spencer Tracy as Clarence Darrow, Frederick March as William Jennings Bryan, and Gene Kelly as H.L. Mencken. And that brought this epic courtroom battle to generations of people, and it can still be streamed today.
Oh, yeah, watch it.
If you do watch it, they changed the names. Like they said, they fictionalized it, so his name's not Clarence Darrow, but it is Clarence Darrow, right? So they changed the names. And I have kind of a crush on Gene Kelly, so I enjoy watching it. I always have. Okay, and the trial is also commemorated by the Ray County Historical Society, which maintains the Scopes Monkey Trial Museum in Dayton, Tennessee. They recently held a massive 100-year celebration of the trial, and the museum is housed in the county courthouse where the famous trial took place. It's in the basement. The courthouse is kept the way it looked, and then the basement has the exhibits. And George Rappleyea is right there. He got his picture right in the middle. So now I'm going to play a quick 3-minute newsreel so you can see footage from the actual trial. And George Rappleyea is in here, so keep an eye out for him. He's wearing a white suit and smoking a cigarette. So and I think he's short. He's pretty easy to watch, to catch. Let me see if I can get this going.
Milestones of the century. In 1925, biology teacher John Scopes spiraled to fame in the legal battle that became known as the monkey trial. Whether man was descended from the monkey or just making a monkey out of man was fought in a courtroom that challenged the truth of the Darwin theory of evolution. The existence of man in the prehistoric world was denied, for according to the Bible, life began with Adam and Eve. An atmosphere of carnival invaded the sleepy little town of Dayton, Tennessee. As signs and demonstrations ballyhooed the conflict between religion and science. As the world waited, hundreds jammed the courtroom to see if man's intelligence and belief could be controlled by law. The giants of legal oratory, Dudley Field Malone and Clarence Darrow, defended John Scopes' beliefs before the world. It was John Butler's anti-evolutionary law that prohibited the teaching of any theory that denied the story of divine creation. Assistant to the state prosecutor was William Jennings Bryan, who adamantly crusaded against a scientific and atheistic world. Raised in a devout Christian environment, he believed that any education that destroyed the religious faith could not be endured. William Jennings Bryan and Clarence Darrow fought a battle of words. Calico and coveralls packed the courtroom to protect the faith against the foreigners and to find out what this new evolution was all about. On a hot summer's day in the courtroom, Judge Ralston, whose career had never extended beyond the borders of Tennessee, swore in a jury of farmers. The press and public listened with unprecedented interest as the legal brains of both sides dug deeper and deeper into the conflicting theories of man's heritage. In this bitter legal engagement, the defense fought against the inherent belief and faith that challenged the credibility of science. At the return of the indictment against John Scopes, Ralston, a small-town jurist, became the center of world judicial interest. As the Scopes trial continued, Judge Neal, another renowned jurist, was called to bolster the defense counsel of Clarence Darrow and Dudley Field Malone. Few trials in all the history of the American bar held the interest of the nation. The defense listened caustically as William Jennings Bryan refuted scientific evidence as insidious doctrines, robbing the faithful of their chance for eternal life. In this rare dramatic moment, Clarence Darrow was unable to get this evidence accepted into the record. The result, a verdict of guilty. John Scopes was fined $100. Darwin had lost, and the monkey was on the run. The jury's verdict had removed the fears of man's descendancy from the minds of the people as they returned to a life of virtue and certainty. The monkey trial was a legal carnival to be remembered among the judicial milestones of the century.
Okay. It's kind of fun to see it firsthand, isn't it? So the Scopes trial resonates today still because so many of the issues that led up to the trial and so many of the questions these men were trying to resolve are still with us. We look back at like that video and think, oh, how quaint. But 100 years later, we're still grappling with many of the same themes today. Who controls what our children are taught? Where's the line between religious belief and public education? What's the role of science in a democracy? George Rappleyea didn't just start a court case. He threw a match on a pile of kindling that is still burning a century later. So, after a trial that captured the world's attention, what happened to the man who started it all? What became of George Rappleyea, the Southport innovator? Well, he didn't stick around Dayton for long. The trial had made him somewhat famous, but it didn't make Dayton the boomtown he'd hoped for. So, true to his nature, he moved on. And for the next 2 decades, he lived a life that sounds somewhat like it was pulled from a dime store adventure novel. When he first left Dayton, he worked as an engineer for several companies in New Orleans and Maryland, first designing prefab homes and then high-end motorboats. Eventually, he found his way to Higgins Industry in New Orleans, where he played several roles working closely with the president, Andrew Higgins. He became the vice president in charge of Latin American projects and surveys, public relations and advertising, right up his alley, schools for military personnel once the war came, schools for plant training, plant production, patent procurement, and research development covering the procurement of approximately 100 patents in boats, motors, machinery, planes, and plastics. He also found time to write and publish a book in 1943 entitled Navigation Wrinkles for Combat Motorboats. So I want to take a moment to talk about Higgins Industries, where he worked, so you can understand how important it was to the war effort. Higgins was the exclusive maker of these boats. We've all seen these pictures, right? And if you're like me, you never thought to question where those boats came from or how they got them. But Higgins designed them for the war effort. They're called LCVPs, which stand for Landing Crafts, Vehicles, and Personnel. So they could bring all of that right to the shore. And And before Higgins designed these boats, troops that were trying to get to shore to partake in a battle were often had to climb over the sides of their boats and get into the water further out. And that left them open to enemy fire before they even reached shore. But Andrew Higgins developed the boat with this forward ramp, and that allowed soldiers to disembark quickly and directly onto the beach. They're not quite on the beach here, but a lot of times they're directly on the beach, and which minimized their exposure to enemy fire. The boats were so important that they're referred to as the patented boats that won the war. And none other than General Dwight D. Eisenhower said that if Higgins had not designed and built those LCVPs, we never could have landed over an open beach. The whole strategy of the war would have been different. And because of the profound impact the landing craft had on military operations and Allied success on D-Day in Normandy and also in North Africa and Italy, Eisenhower declared that Andrew Higgins was the man who won the war for us. And so, in many ways, George Rappleyea was his right-hand man. Each of those boats could carry 36 men, and they were run by a crew of 4. And as his role in vice president for Higgins, Rappleyea ran the schools that trained the personnel to run those boats. More than 30,000 people went through the schools that he was running. So here you can see a whole line of those boats heading to France for the invasion of Normandy. This is a monument on Utah Beach in Normandy that includes a Higgins boat. And this is a photo of Rappleyea with Andrew Higgins, president of Higgins Boats and designer of the Higgins boats. And this is an article from the Southport Pilot celebrating that Rappleyea was a vice president at Higgins and describing the contribution he made to the war effort. And somewhere in there between his many responsibilities at Higgins and writing a book, he also became a pilot. And so after the war, he flew his own planes across Latin America as an aerial photogrammetric engineer, making maps for businesses. His life was, as he put it, a more or less adventuresome life. Sometimes, though, his adventures were not well thought out. In one instance, he endured a brief stint in a Texas federal prison for his role in a shadowy plot to arm revolutionaries in Latin America. It was an enterprise which may or may not have been backed by the CIA. But eventually, after all of that adventure, George Rappleyea came home. He and Ova came back here to Southport. They settled into a house on the corner of Moore and Boundary that he had bought with his mother so many years before. And so it's really hard to see in this picture, but it's over there. I don't quite understand the picture. It was labeled in the Southport Pilot as definitely saying that's George Rappleyea's house on the corner of Moore and Caswell, and that it was originally a Thompson house, and they pointed it out. But maybe you guys know better than I do. It doesn't seem to me that you can see Caswell from the Indian Trail tree. But maybe there were less buildings there then, you know. I mean, I'm trusting the Southport Pilot because they were there at the time and they said that's that house over there, but it just seems a little odd to me. But anyway, that's where the house was. And just when you think George is going to fade into retirement, his story takes another remarkable turn. His inventive, restless engineer mind was still working hard on inventions. And this wasn't just a hobby. George was a serious inventor who had been granted a number of patents for his work over the years for everything from navigational position finders to an aerial camera. He wasn't just some eccentric backyard inventor. He was a professional engineer with a marketer's mindset. He set up a small workshop and company called the Tropical Research Laboratory in the garage behind his house. And in that garage, he came up with his most well-known invention, an idea so strange, yet so brilliant, it sounds like something from a fantasy. He was obsessed with plastics and finding ways to build cheap, durable housing. So he came up with the idea that if you took thick, black-strap molasses, dried it into powdered granules, mixed it with heavy bunker fuel oil, some clay, and some sand, you could create a revolutionary new building material. He named this material plasmaphalt, from plastic, molasses, and asphalt. And it wasn't just a theory, he made it. It could be formed into bricks or poured like concrete for driveways. And he did that in Southport. He'd make the bricks and he poured it on his driveway. And this is a house, it's his house in Southport, but he's got part of it covered. It says the above photo is a section of the original plasma fault pilot plant at Southport, North Carolina. The roofing material is regulation gray-black asphalt shingles. The left side was treated with a green plasma fault emulsion roof and barn paint. And the right side was painted with plasma coat, which was his second invention. He added fiber to it and created this plasma coat, which could be used like stucco on exterior walls and floors, and or exterior walls and then smooth for interior walls and floors. And he even claimed that termites and other insects wanted no part of it. But the most incredible thing was the cost. He claimed he could build a 5-room house with his plasma fault for less than $1,000. It was astonishing. And this wasn't just some quirky local project. His little Southport garage lab got national attention. The hugely popular magazine Popular Mechanics sent a reporter right here to Southport to do a major story on his invention. This is just the first couple pages of that article. It goes on for several more pages with lots of pictures. They took pictures of his lab and told the world about this man who was planning to build houses out of molasses. The following year, the U.S. government became interested in his patented invention, and they awarded him a $36,000 grant, which was about $438,000, to develop it for military use for building aircraft runways. It was quick drying. And it also, if it was damaged or gouged, it would tend to repair itself. It would come back. So, after instigating the trial of the century and traveling the world, George Rappleyea's greatest and most hand-on inventing was done right here in the garage in the heart of Southport. So we have this incredibly complex picture of a complex man, George Rappleyea, a modernizer who first lit up Southport homes with electricity, an adventurer who traveled the world, a promoter who instigated the trial of the century, and an inventor who right here in Southport tried to sculpt the future out of molasses and sand. George always said that his goal was to retire in Southport, but in the end, he spent his final years in Miami, where he passed away in 1966 at the age of 72. He was buried with honor in Arlington National Cemetery. As I was doing the research on this, I was digging through the records in the Southport Historical Society online database that Bob is responsible for creating. And I was amazed to find that in 1966, just about 5 months before he died, he wrote a letter to the Southport city manager, C.D. Pickrell, who you see here. And in that letter, you can see that his mind, even at the end of his life, was still focused on progress and potential. But he wasn't thinking about a grand national debate or some revolutionary invention. He was thinking about Southport. He looked at Southport and he saw its most powerful untapped resource, its own story. He wrote, "Southport is knee-deep in history. Certainly there should be a museum there. Perhaps the garrison and Fort Johnston could be made into a museum." He continued laying out a vision for the future. You know, the Women's Club could promote an annual pageant or festival. And remember, he was living in Florida, so he was thinking about this kind of stuff. Every Florida-bound tourist that makes the detour and visits Southport will spend an average of $50. You can get the state highway department to place a history marker. And so he was just coming up with... So at the time, these must have seemed like ambitious, even unattainable ideas, but what's truly amazing, what makes his story so perfect to tell with all of you, is that his vision came true. He wrote that letter in 1966. 10 years later, in 1976, the Southport Historical Society was founded to do the exact work that he was calling for. He suggested a museum in the Garrison House at Fort Johnston, and a little more than 40 years after he suggested it, the Historical Society made his vision a reality, opening the museum right where he had suggested. So George Rappleyea was always looking toward the future. He saw the economic power of tourism, and today, as we all know, a major proportion of Southport's revenue comes from those very visitors that he envisioned. So in the end, the man who started his career by physically lighting up Southport with electricity and who once shone a national spotlight on the deep and difficult questions of his time left us with one final brilliant idea, that our most enduring light is our history. His life is a powerful reminder that sometimes the biggest stories and the most prophetic visions have their roots right here in our own backyard. And I couldn't help imagining the delight that George Rappleyea, ever the promoter, would have felt knowing that he himself had become a subject of a discussion in our Southport history, drawing us all together this morning to celebrate his legacy. So, thank you very much. If you have any questions. Jesse.
What was in 1925? I'm assuming George Rappleyea was a well-known household name here in Southport at that time.
I don't know. When he was written up in the paper, that was in the 40s he was written up in the paper. I don't know, because we don't have a paper in 25. We don't have records of the paper in 25. We had a bit of a paper.
So do we have any evidence of of the reception of his role in the trial was here?
It's hard to say. The only thing I have is for when he moved back. And so by then, a lot of time had passed. And he does mention in the articles, they mention he was influential in Scopes' monkey trial. He mentions it so as though it was something to mention, but I wish we did have some kind of, and that's a good question. Maybe I can look in the Wilmington papers, not so much that they'll mention Rappleyea, but just to see what the take is if they were mentioning the Scopes monkey trial and what people thought of it. That's a good question. I didn't look at that.
About what year was he in prison in Texas?
48.
So, okay.
He was arrested in 47. What he ended up doing was pleading guilty. He and two other men pled guilty for, they took a plea deal. They served a year and a day. So he was, when they arrested him, he just couldn't keep his mouth quiet. So they arrested him. He was the treasurer for this company, the Gulfport, apparently, and they were dealing with, he was going to Cuba, he was going to Latin America, it was British Honduras, I think that the charge was, and they were stockpiling this weaponry, significant weaponry, and when they arrested him, some reporter asked him a question, he said, I don't know anything about it, I did hear some rumor that the boys were getting some guns, they wanted to go hunting when we were there. So he just couldn't keep his mouth quiet. And there was some rumor of were they involved with the CIA? The CIA had just started. And of course they're going to deny it. I don't know. Were they doing it on their own? They were doing dealings down there. What were they I don't know what they were trying to do. And I don't know exactly who they were trying to help overthrow what government, or if they were doing it for money. There's no, I think they didn't, unfortunately didn't have to say. But it was funny, the FBI is who caught them. So, I don't know, you kind of think, right, the CIA was new, the FBI wasn't that old, it started in 1925, but anyway, that was, yeah. I didn't really focus on it too much, but I thought it was fascinating. And I did see some letters that he wrote to, because his mom died. He was arrested in March. His mom died about 6 months later. I don't know whether she knew he'd been arrested because she had a heart attack. I'm hoping she didn't know. But he was trying to manage that. He's got this court stuff going on down in New Orleans. He's trying to manage the house and his mother's affairs and all this. I think he came back for the funeral. But he's writing letters to Bunfrink, the attorney, and explaining stuff to him. But what I noticed in the letters I was looking at, there's a gap when he's in prison, but he's also saying, I'm going to be away on business. I thought, oh, okay. So, I'm sorry. Mary, yeah.
Are there any examples in the historic buildings in Southport still have the plasma cutting or the...
His house it doesn't exist anymore. I think that's where he mostly did it. I tried to find out. I'd heard that Catherine Colmanson is the daughter of Susie Carson, who started the Historical Society, and they knew George Rappleyea. And I wanted to ask Catherine. I think maybe Susie rented his house a little bit. I'm not sure, but because she worked for Bunfrink, anyway, they were friends. And I heard that Catherine has a knife with a knife handle that's made out of it, but I didn't get a chance to connect with her to find out if she has it or if she knows where it is or
And I can't imagine termites not eating something made of molasses.
I know. I don't know. I don't know that he was always constrained to the truth. I don't know. Maybe. I mean, he had other things in there, but I don't know. I mean, the military did buy one of his patents for the runway stuff, and it was legit at the time. Any other questions?
Did his mother die here?
Yes,
Okay.
she did die here at Dosher. She just went in for a few hours. They were trying to get her to go earlier. She's like, I'm fine, you know.
And then was she buried here?
She was not. She was sent back to, I think, Mount Pleasant, New York, someplace in New York, to be near her husband.
And no generation, like he had no children?
He didn't have any children. But I was thinking, as I was doing this, I was thinking, oh, we could claim him for Living Voices. Wouldn't that be? I mean, that's close enough connection, you know? I don't think anybody else has him. He was born in New York. New York.
Upstate New York.
Yes, I don't remember what town he was born in.
His mother went back to probably.
Probably, yeah. That's where his dad was buried, so that's where they sent her back. And then he was buried at Arlington, and then his wife was buried back in Tennessee. So I think we have enough of a claim to talk to him at Living Voices. I think either him or his mother, she could brag on him, whichever but I think that would be a good addition to our Living Voices. And from what I understand too, Catherine said she knew him, she was a little girl, but she said he was a very nice man. And I can see from the letters, he was a very nice person. So anyway. Okay, any other questions? Okay.